In the shadowy halls of Tippington Manor, a silver teapot whispers secrets of a family's legacy. Miss Jane Marple, an unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind, arrives to uncover why a single scream in the night shatters the calm. Is it theft, deception, or something darker hidden in the teapot's cryptic engravings? Asterisk, as whispers of scandal swirl around Sylvia Grey, the fiancée of heir Charles Harrow, the teapot vanishes, revealing a hidden codicil that could strip him of his inheritance. Someone is spreading lies, someone is hiding the truth, and Miss Marple's keen eyes see through the shadows of greed and fear. Asterisk, in a chilling confrontation, the teapot's truth emerges, exposing a plot of betrayal that could destroy a family. Will Miss Marple unravel the mystery before the manor's secrets claim their prize? One truth remains. In shadows, the sharpest eyes find the light. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Tippington Manor, the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the seasons turned with predictable grace and the gossip flowed as steadily as the stream by the vicarage. Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage window, her delicate fingers guiding a pair of knitting needles through a soft skein of wool. The late summer light filtered through the lace curtains, casting intricate patterns across the room, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of roses from her garden. It was a morning like any other, save for the arrival of the post, which brought with it an envelope that piqued her curiosity. The envelope was of fine cream paper, embossed with the crest of Tippington Manor, a grand estate some 20 miles distant, nestled in the rolling hills of the county. Miss Marple, with her keen eye for detail, noted the elegant script of the address and the faint tremble in the handwriting that suggested either haste or nerves. She opened it with care, unfolding a letter from Lady Beatrice Harrow, a woman she had known years ago through a mutual acquaintance at a charitable committee in London. The letter was an invitation to a weekend gathering at Tippington Manor to celebrate the engagement of Beatrice's nephew, Charles Harrow, to a young woman named Sylvia Grey. The tone was formal, yet there was an undercurrent of urgency that Miss Marple, with her lifelong study of human nature, could not ignore. "My dear Miss Marple," the letter began, "it has been too long since we last met, and I find myself eager for the company of an old friend. Charles's engagement is a joyous occasion, and I should be delighted if you would join us at Tippington to mark it. Your presence would bring such comfort to an old woman's heart." The words were gracious, but Miss Marple's sharp mind detected a note of strain beneath the pleasantries. Beatrice had always been a composed woman, yet here was a hint of something unspoken, a shadow that lingered between the lines. Miss Marple set the letter down and gazed out at her garden, where the dahlias were in full bloom, their vibrant heads nodding in the breeze. She had no particular plans for the weekend, and the prospect of a change of scene was not unwelcome. Moreover, her curiosity was stirred. Beatrice Harrow was not one to issue invitations lightly, and Tippington Manor, though grand, was rarely open to guests these days. The Harrows, she recalled, had faced financial strain since the death of Beatrice's husband, Sir Reginald, some years prior. Charles, the heir, was a young man of promise, but whispers of the family's dwindling fortunes had reached even St. Mary Mead. And who was Sylvia Grey? The name was unfamiliar, and Miss Marple's mind, ever attuned to the nuances of social connections, wondered at the match. She rose from her chair, her movements sprightly despite her years, and crossed to the small writing desk in the corner. With a neat hand, she penned her acceptance, expressing her delight at the invitation and her anticipation of the weekend. As she sealed the envelope, Her thoughts turned to the teapot mentioned in Beatrice's postscript of family heirloom. She had written, said to hold the truth in its cryptic inscriptions. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Such romantic notions often cloaked more practical secrets, and she suspected the teapot might prove more significant than mere decoration. The following day, Miss Marple packed a modest suitcase, including her best black lace dress for dinner and a warm shawl for the cool evenings. She tucked her knitting into a tapestry bag, for she found that the rhythmic click of her needles often encouraged others to speak freely, revealing more than they intended. Her maid, Florence, fussed over her departure, insisting on packing a tin of homemade shortbread in case the manor's cook is wanting. Miss Marple, amused, allowed the indulgence, and by mid-morning she was aboard the train to Tippington, the countryside unfolding beyond the window in a patchwork of green fields and golden harvests. The journey was uneventful, save for a brief conversation with a fellow passenger, a young curate who spoke earnestly of his parish duties. Miss Marple listened with her usual courtesy, her mild blue eyes giving no hint of the thoughts that turned behind them. She arrived at Tippington Station as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. A chauffeured car awaited her, its driver a taciturn man named Hodges, who tipped his cap and loaded her suitcase with care. The drive to the manor wound through narrow lanes, past hedgerows heavy with blackberries and ancient oaks that stood like sentinels against the fading light. Tippington Manor came into view as they crested a hill, its silhouette imposing against the twilight. The house was a sprawling edifice of grey stone, its ivy-clad walls softened by centuries of weather and time. Tall chimneys rose above the gabled roofs, and the windows glowed with the warm light of lamps within. Miss Marple, stepping from the car, felt a shiver of anticipation. The manor was beautiful, yet there was a sense of weight about it, as if it bore the burdens of those who dwelled within. Lady Beatrice Harrow greeted her in the entrance hall, a cavernous space adorned with ancestral portraits and a vast chandelier that glittered faintly in the candlelight. Beatrice was a tall woman, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her black silk gown rustling as she moved. Her face, lined with age but still handsome, lit with a smile as she took Miss Marple's hands. "Jane, my dear, how good of you to come," she said, her voice warm but tinged with a tremor that confirmed Miss Marple's earlier suspicions. "It's been far too long." "Far too long indeed," Miss Marple replied, her smile gentle. "And what a lovely occasion to bring us together. I'm so looking forward to meeting Charles's fiancée." Beatrice's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, so brief that only someone as observant as Miss Marple would have noticed. "Yes, Sylvia is a charming girl," she said, leading the way to the drawing room. "Come, you must be tired. From your journey, we'll have tea, and I'll introduce you to the others." The drawing room was a study in faded grandeur, its walls lined with damask paper and its furniture polished to a soft sheen. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room, and a silver tea service gleamed on a low table. The other guests were already assembled, and Miss Marple's eyes moved swiftly over them, cataloguing first impressions with the precision of a naturalist. Charles Harrow stood by the mantel, a tall young man with dark hair and a face that might have been called handsome were it not for the tension in his jaw. His eyes, a striking shade of hazel, darted toward the door as Miss Marple entered, and he offered a polite smile that did not reach them. Beside him stood Sylvia Grey, a slender woman in her mid-20s, her auburn hair pinned in soft waves and her green eyes watchful beneath long lashes. She wore a simple dress of pale blue, and her hands, clasped before her, betrayed a slight tremble. Miss Marple noted her poise, but sensed a fragility beneath it. As if she were bracing for an unseen blow, Dr. Ernest Quill, a retired physician, with a shock of white hair and a face creased with cynicism, lounged in an armchair, a glass of sherry in hand. His sharp tongue was already at work, for he greeted Miss Marple with a sardonic remark about the rustic charms of St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Clara Dunham, a wealthy widow whose penchant for gossip was matched only by her fondness for ostentatious jewelry, sat on a sofa, her beaded gown catching the firelight. She smiled broadly at Miss Marple, her eyes gleaming with the anticipation of new material for her endless tales. Finally, Mr. Victor Lane, a solicitor with a perpetually furrowed brow and a manner that suggested he carried the weight of others' secrets, stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Beatrice made the introductions with practiced ease, and Miss Marple responded with her usual blend of modesty and warmth, her unassuming demeanor inviting others to underestimate her. As they sat for tea, she observed the dynamics of the group. Charles and Sylvia sat close, but did not touch, their conversation stilted. Beatrice hovered, her eyes flitting between her nephew and his fiancée, while Clara Dunham launched into a monologue about a recent scandal in London, her voice carrying over the clink of teacups. Dr. Quill interjected with dry wit, and Victor Lane remained silent, his gaze fixed on the teapot at the table's center. The teapot was a remarkable object, its silver surface etched with intricate patterns of vines and flowers, interspersed with cryptic symbols and Latin phrases. It was larger than most, with a gracefully curved spout and a lid crowned by a tiny acorn finial. Miss Marple, accepting a cup of tea poured by Beatrice, remarked on its beauty. "What a splendid piece," she said, her tone admiring. "It must have quite a history." Beatrice's face softened, though her eyes remained guarded. "Oh, it's been in the family for generations," she said. "My late husband, Reginald, was fascinated by it. He used to say it held the truth, though I'm sure he was only teasing. The inscriptions are said to contain some family secret, but no one's ever deciphered them." She laughed, a brittle sound that did not match her words. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes lingering on the teapot. "How intriguing," she murmured. "Truth is such a curious thing, isn't it? So often hidden in plain sight." The conversation shifted, but Miss Marple's attention remained on the teapot. She noted the way Charles glanced at it, his expression unreadable, and the way Sylvia's fingers tightened around her teacup when Beatrice spoke of it. Dr. Quill, catching her gaze, made a scoffing remark about superstitious nonsense, but Miss Marple sensed he was more interested than he let on. Clara Dunham, ever eager to contribute, mentioned a rumor that the teapot concealed a hidden compartment, though she dismissed it as fanciful. Victor Lane, still silent, shifted his weight, and Miss Marple wondered what he knew. Dinner was served in the dining room, a vast chamber with a long mahogany table and walls hung with tapestries depicting pastoral scenes. The meal was exquisite consomme, followed by roasted pheasant and a delicate lemon soufflé, but the atmosphere was strained. Charles spoke little, his attention divided between his plate and Sylvia, who picked at her food with an air of distraction. Beatrice, at the head of the table, maintained a stream of polite conversation, but her hands betrayed her nerves, fidgeting with her napkin. Clara Dunham dominated the talk, regaling the table with tales of her travels, while Dr. Quill's acerbic comments drew occasional laughter. Victor Lane, seated beside Miss Marple, offered only monosyllabic replies to her gentle inquiries, his eyes straying to the teapot, which now stood on a sideboard, its silver catching the candlelight. Miss Marple, eating sparingly, observed the interplay of glances and silences. She noted the way Sylvia avoided Charles's gaze, and the way Beatrice watched them both, her expression a mixture of affection and concern. Dr. Quill's barbed remarks seemed aimed at Charles, though their meaning was oblique, and Clara's chatter, though tiresome, revealed a sharp ear for gossip. Victor Lane's reticence was telling, for Miss Marple knew that those who spoke least often saw the most. As the meal ended and the guests retired to the drawing-room for coffee, Miss Marple lingered in the dining room, ostensibly to admire a tapestry. Alone, she approached the teapot, her fingers brushing its cool surface. The inscriptions were indeed complex, a blend of Latin and symbols that suggested a code. One phrase stood out, Veritas in Umbris, truth in shadows. She committed it to memory, her mind already turning over its possible meanings. The teapot was heavy, its base solid, but she detected a faint seam, as if it might conceal a compartment. Before she could examine it further, footsteps approached, and she stepped back, resuming her study of the tapestry as Beatrice entered. "Jane, you'll catch a chill standing here," Beatrice said, her tone light but her eyes searching. "Come, join us for coffee." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her smile serene. As they left the room, she glanced back at the teapot, its silver gleaming like a promisor, a warning dot in the drawing room. The guests were more relaxed, the coffee and liqueurs loosening tongues. Clara Dunham, emboldened, hinted at rumours. About Sylvia's pastor whispered scandal in London, perhaps involving a man of dubious character. Sylvia's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing, her eyes fixed on her coffee cup. Charles, beside her, stiffened, his hand clenching into a fist. Beatrice quickly changed the subject, but Miss Marple noted the damage done. Dr. Quill, watching with a glint of amusement, made a cryptic remark about skeletons in closets, and Victor Lane excused himself, claiming fatigue as the evening drew to a close. Miss Marple retired to her room, a comfortable chamber with a four-poster bed and a view of the moonlit gardens. She sat by the window, her knitting in her lap, but her needles were still. Her mind was busy, sorting through the day's observations. The teapot, with its enigmatic inscriptions, was clearly more than a relic. It was a focal point for the tensions she had sensed. Beatrice's unease, Charles's distraction, Sylvia's fragility, Quill's malice, Clara's gossip, Lane's secrecy, each was a thread in a tapestry she could not yet see in full. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where human nature revealed itself in small, familiar ways, and realized that Tippington Manor, for all its grandeur, was no different. People were people, their fears and desires as transparent here as in her village. The teapot, she suspected, held a truth that someone wished to keep a dunner, truth that might explain the shadows she had glimpsed in every face that evening. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple resolved to watch and listen, her unassuming presence her greatest asset. The weekend had only begun, and she sensed that the teapot's secret would not remain buried for long. With a final glance at the moon, she slipped beneath the covers, her mind alert even as her body rested. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring new clues on, perhaps new dangers. Chapter 2. The whisper of scandal the morning after her arrival at Tippington Manor. Miss Jane Marple rose early, her habits as punctual as the village clock in St. Mary Mead. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew-soaked grass through the open window of her bedroom. She dressed in a neat tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan, her silver hair pinned tidily beneath a modest hat, and descended to the breakfast room, her knitting bag slung over one arm. The manor was quiet, its corridors hushed, save for the distant clatter of servants preparing the day's meals. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the polished banisters and the faint wear on the carpet. Signs of a house maintained with effort rather than ease. The breakfast room was bathed in soft light, its tall windows overlooking the rose garden. Sideboard groaned under the weight of silver dishes, kajori, kidneys, scrambled eggs, and racks of toast, while the silver teapot, that enigmatic heirloom, stood sentinel on a velvet cloth. Miss Marple, taking her place at the table, greeted the few early risers with her customary smile. Lady Beatrice Harrow, already seated, looked pale, her hands fluttering over a cup of tea. Charles Harrow entered shortly after, his face drawn, as if sleep had eluded him. Sylvia Grey was absent, and Miss Marple wondered if the young woman's nerves, so evident the previous evening, had kept her abed. "Good morning, Jane," Beatrice said, her voice striving for brightness. "I trust you slept well." "Quite well, thank you," Miss Marple replied, accepting a cup of tea from a maid. "The manor is so peaceful in the morning. One almost forgets the bustle of the world outside." Charles managed a nod, his eyes fixed on his plate. Miss Marple, buttering a slice of toast, observed the tension in his shoulders. The silence was broken by the arrival of Mrs. Clara Dunham, her bracelets jangling as she swept into the room. "What a divine morning," she exclaimed, helping herself to a generous portion of kedgeree. "Though I dare say, Beatrice, your cook outdoes herself. I shall have to steal her for my townhouse." Beatrice smiled thinly, and Miss Marple noted the strain in her hostess's eyes. Clara, oblivious, launched into a monologue about a recent ball in London, her voice carrying the relish of one who thrived on social tidbits. It was not long before she turned her attention to Sylvia, her tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I hear Miss Grey was quite the talk in London last season," she said, her eyes gleaming. "Something about a gentleman and artist, I believe, who was rather too married for comfort. Of course, it's all hearsay, but one does wonder." Charles's fork clattered against his plate, and he shot Clara a look of barely concealed irritation. "Mrs. Dunham, I'd thank you to keep such gossip to yourself," he said, his voice low but sharp. "Sylvia is my fiancée, and her past is no one's concern." Clara raised an eyebrow, undeterred. "My dear Charles, I meant no offense. Only that London is such a small world, and stories do travel." She turned to Miss Marple, seeking an ally. "Don't you find, Miss Marple, that people are endlessly fascinating in their little indiscretions?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she began to knit, her expression one of mild interest. "People are indeed fascinating," she said, "though I find it's often the stories we tell ourselves that reveal the most. Gossip, after all, is like a cracked mirror, distorted, but with a glimmer of truth." Clara laughed, missing the subtle rebuke, while Beatrice interjected with a request for more tea, her voice betraying a flicker of unease. Miss Marple sipped her own tea, her eyes moving from Charles's clenched jaw to Beatrice's trembling hands. The teapot, gleaming on the sideboard, seemed to watch over the scene, its inscriptions a silent challenge to unravel. After breakfast, Miss Marple excused herself to the drawing-room, where she settled by a window with a view of the garden. The roses were in full bloom, their petals vivid against the green. and she spotted Sylvia Grey walking alone, her head bowed. The young woman's solitude suggested a need for reflection, and Miss Marple wondered what burdens she carried. Before she could ponder further, Dr. Ernest Quill entered, his white hair dishevelled and his expression sour. He sank into an armchair, muttering about the damp air aggravating his rheumatism. "Good morning, Dr. Quill," Miss Marple said, her tone cheerful. "You seem out of sorts. I hope the manor's comforts are not wanting." Quill snorted, eyeing her over his spectacles. "Comforts are all well and good, but this place is a mausoleum. Too many secrets buried in these walls. And that teapot nonsense pure folly. Beatrice ought to sell it and be done with it." Miss Marple's needles paused. "The teapot is rather striking," she said. "I understand it's been in the family for generations. Such objects often carry stories, don't they?" "Stories?" Quill scoffed. "Superstition, more like. Reginald Harrow was obsessed with it, always prattling about its truth. Load of rubbish, if you ask me. The only truth here is that the Harrows are clinging to a crumbling estate, and Charles's marriage won't fix it." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression serene. "You think the marriage ill-advised?" Quill hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I think Charles is a fool to tie himself to a girl with a questionable past. Sylvia Grey may be charming, but charm doesn't pay debts. Beatrice knows it too, though she won't say it outright." Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. Quill's bluntness was revealing, but she sensed he was holding something back, a motive, perhaps for his disdain. Before she could probe further, the door opened, and Victor Lane entered, his face as furrowed as ever. He greeted them curtly, then busied himself with a newspaper, though Miss Marple noted his eyes strayed often to the teapot. Now placed on a side table, the morning passed quietly, with the guests dispersing to various pursuits. Miss Marple, claiming a desire for fresh air, ventured into the garden, where she found Sylvia seated on a stone bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The young woman started at Miss Marple's approach, but her expression softened upon recognizing her. "Miss Marple," Sylvia said, her voice low, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I find gardens so soothing," Miss Marple replied, settling beside her, "and you seemed in need of a quiet moment. I hope I'm not intruding." Sylvia shook her head, her green eyes shadowed. "No, it's kind of you. I just needed to think. There's so much talk here, and not all of it kind." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a comforting sound. "Talk can be unkind," she said, "especially when it's fueled by envy or fear. But you mustn't let it trouble you too much, my dear. People often speak to fill the silence, not to seek the truth." Sylvia's lips trembled, and she looked away. "They say things about me, about my past, things that aren't true or not entirely true. I loved someone once, but it ended. I thought coming here with Charles would be a fresh start, but it follows me." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch gentle but firm. "My dear, the past is only a shadow if you let it be. You're here now with a young man who loves you. Hold to that." Sylvia managed a small smile, but her eyes remained wary. Miss Marple, sensing she would say no more, rose to return to the house, her mind cataloguing the girl's words. Sylvia's vulnerability was genuine, but there was strength there, to a determination that suggested she was no mere victim of gossip. Back in the drawing room, Miss Marple found Beatrice examining the teapot, her fingers tracing its intricate engravings. "Jane, you've caught me at a foolish moment," Beatrice said, laughing nervously. "I was just thinking of Reginald. He loved this old thing. Said it held the key to our family's honor." Miss Marple peered at the teapot, her spectacles catching the light. "It's a remarkable piece," she said. "Those inscriptions, I believe, do they tell a story?" Beatrice hesitated, then pointed to a phrase etched near the spout. "Veritas in Umbris, truth in shadows," she translated. Reginald thought it meant something about hidden truths, perhaps a secret the family kept, but it's probably just decorative nonsense. Miss Marple nodded, her expression bland. "Perhaps," she said, though her mind was far from dismissive. The teapot, she suspected, was more than a reliquate, was a symbol, perhaps a key, to the tensions simmering in the manor. As the day wore on, Miss Marple observed the guests with quiet intensity. At luncheon, Clara Dunham continued her veiled barbs, hinting at Sylvia's colourful history. While Charles grew increasingly withdrawn, Dr. Quill's remarks took on a sharper edge, questioning the wisdom of Charles's engagement in a way that seemed calculated to provoke. Victor Lane, meanwhile, remained aloof, his eyes darting to the teapot whenever it was mentioned. Beatrice, striving to maintain harmony, seemed on the verge of exhaustion, her smiles brittled by afternoon. Miss Marple retired to the library, a cozy room lined with leather-bound books and heavy drapes. She settled into an armchair, her knitting in her lap, and let her thoughts wander. The teapot, with its cryptic inscriptions, was clearly a focal point. But why? Was it merely a family legend, or did it conceal something, tangible, a document, perhaps, or a clue to the Harrow fortune? And Sylvia's past, so eagerly dissected by Clara and Quill, was it a distraction or a motive? As she pondered, Miss Marple's eyes fell on a small painting above the fireplace, a portrait of a Harrow ancestor, stern-faced, with the teapot prominently displayed on a table beside him. The coincidence was striking, and she made a mental note to inquire further. For now, she knew one thing. The whisper of scandal surrounding Sylvia was only the surface of a deeper truth, and the teapot, gleaming silently, held the key. Chapter 3. The midnight disturbance. The second evening at Tippington Manor unfolded with the deceptive calm of a summer night. The air heavy with the scent of jasmine drifting through the open windows of the drawing-room. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her knitting needles moving with their steady rhythm, observed the guests with the quiet attentiveness of one accustomed to seeing beyond the surface. The fire cast a warm glow over the room, softening the edges of the antique furniture and the strained faces of those gathered. Yet the atmosphere was taut, like a violin string tuned too tightly. Dinner had been a subdued affair, the clink of silverware and the murmur of polite conversation barely masking the undercurrents of unease. Lady Beatrice Harrow, ever the gracious hostess, had steered the talk toward neutral topics, the weather, the upcoming village fete, but her eyes betrayed her fatigue, darting often to her nephew, Charles Harrow, and his fiancée, Sylvia Grey. Charles had been withdrawn, his responses curt, while Sylvia, pale and composed, had spoken little, her gaze fixed on the silver teapot that now stood on a sideboard, its engravings catching the candlelight like whispers of secrets. Mrs. Clara Dunham's chatter had filled the silences, her anecdotes laced with veiled references to Sylvia's rumoured past, while Dr. Ernest Quill's sardonic remarks had drawn uneasy laughter. Mr. Victor Lane, the solicitor, had remained silent, his furrowed brow deepening as the evening wore on. Now, in the drawing-room, the guests lingered over coffee and liqueurs, the hour growing late. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted the small tells that revealed the group's disquiet. Beatrice's fingers twisting a lace handkerchief, Charles's restless pacing by the window, Sylvia's sudden flinch at the creak of a floorboard. Clara, undeterred by the mood, was regaling Dr. Quill with a tale of a scandalous elopement in Bath, her voice a jarring contrast to the room's tension. Victor Lane stood apart, his eyes straying to the teapot, which Beatrice had moved to a small table near the hearth. As if to keep it in view, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the teapot, its cryptic inscriptions, Veritas in Umbris truth. In shadows etched in her memory, Beatrice's mention of its legendary truth had been light, almost dismissive, yet the object seemed to exert a strange influence, drawing glances and silences like a magnet. Was it merely a family relic, or did it conceal something more, a document, perhaps, or a clue to the Harrow legacy? The gossip about Sylvia, fanned by Clara and Quill, suggested a motive to discredit her. But Miss Marple sensed the teapot was the true heart of the mystery. As the clock on the mantel struck 11, Beatrice rose, her smile strained. "I think we might all benefit from an early night," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Tomorrow promises to be fine, and we can enjoy the gardens." The guests murmured their agreement, and Miss Marple, gathering her knitting, bid them good night, her mild blue eyes missing nothing as she left the room. Her bedroom, with its heavy drapes and four-poster bed, was quiet save for the distant hoot of an owl. Miss Marple, ever alert despite her years, did not immediately retire. Instead, she sat by the window, her shawl about her shoulders, reflecting on the day's observations. The teapot, Sylvia's distress, Charles's tension, Quill's malice, Clara's gossip, Lane's secrecy. Each was a piece in a puzzle she could not yet assemble. She was about to turn down the lamp when a piercing scream shattered the silence. Echoing through the manor's corridors, Miss Marple, with surprising agility, slipped on her dressing gown and stepped into the hall, her heart steady despite the sudden disturbance. The scream had come from the direction of the dining room, and as she moved toward the staircase, other doors opened, revealing the guests in various states of disarray. Beatrice, her hair loose and her face ashen, clutched a candlestick. Charles, in a hastily donned jacket, looked wild-eyed, while Sylvia, trembling in a white nightgown, clung to the banister. Clara Dunham, her face smeared with cold cream, gasped dramatically, and Dr. Quill, grumbling, adjusted his spectacles. Victor Lane, last to appear, carried a poker, his expression unreadable. "What's happened?" Beatrice demanded, her voice shaking. "Who screamed?" "It was me," Sylvia whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I couldn't sleep, so I went downstairs for a glass of water. In the dining room, I saw someone tampering with the teapot. They fled when I screamed." Charles took her arm, his face hardening. "Nonsense, Sylvia. You must have imagined it. The house is locked tight." "I know what I saw," Sylvia insisted, her voice rising. "A figure in dark clothing, bending over the teapot. I didn't imagine it." Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the group, noted Sylvia's genuine terror and the way Charles's dismissal seemed to wound her. Beatrice, rallying, led the way to the dining room, her candlestick casting flickering shadows on the walls. The room was as they had left it, the long table cleared, the tapestries still. The teapot stood on its velvet cloth, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes detected a subtle change, was slightly askew, as if hastily replaced. Victor Lane, still gripping the poker, examined the teapot, his fingers tracing its base. "It seems intact," he said, his tone guarded. "But the base, it feels hollow. I've heard stories of hidden compartments in such pieces, though I see no mechanism." Beatrice's hand flew to her throat. "A compartment? Surely not. It's just an old teapot, Victor." Dr. Quill snorted, his skepticism undimmed. "Hysteria, that's what this is. Miss Grey, you've worked yourself into a state over nothing. A shadow, a creak, and suddenly it's a thief in the night." Sylvia flushed, but before she could retort, Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft but commanding attention. "It's late, and we're all shaken," she said. "But Miss Grey's fear is real, and the teapot's position has indeed shifted. Perhaps we might secure the room and discuss this in the morning, when our minds are clearer." Beatrice seized on the suggestion, her relief palpable. "Yes, Jane is right. Let's lock the dining room and retire. Hodges can check the grounds at first light." The group dispersed, though not without murmurs. Clara, trailing Miss Marple, whispered, "Mark my words, that girl's hiding something. Why else would she be creeping about at midnight?" Miss Marple smiled vaguely, offering no reply, but her mind was racing. Sylvia's story, though dramatic, rang true, and the teapot's misalignment was no accident. Someone had been in that room, and their purpose was tied to the heirloom's secret. Back in her bedroom, Miss Marple did not sleep. She sat by the window, her knitting untouched, her thoughts turning over the incident. The teapot's hollow base, Victor's quick inspection, Sylvia's fear. Charles's denial. Each detail was a thread in a tapestry of motive and opportunity. She recalled the Latin phrase, Veritas, in Umbris, and wondered if the truth lay not in the teapot itself, but in the shadows it cast over those around it. As the moon climbed higher, Miss Marple resolved to keep a closer watch. The midnight disturbance was no mere fancy, it was a warning, and she sensed the manor's secrets were stirring, ready to break free. Chapter 4. The Solicitor's Discovery. The morning following the midnight disturbance at Tippington Manor dawned with a deceptive serenity. The sky a pale blue, streaked with wisps of cloud, and the gardens below Miss Jane Marple's window alive with the chatter of birds. She had slept little, her mind occupied with the events of the previous night. Sylvia Grey's scream, the teapot's subtle misalignment, and the uneasy glances exchanged among the guests. Dressing in a soft grey frock and pinning her silver hair with care, she descended to the breakfast room, her knitting bag in hand, her mild blue eyes alert for the smallest hint of truth amid the manor's shadows. The breakfast room was quieter than the previous morning, the guests subdued as they gathered around the table. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her face drawn, presided over the meal with a forced cheerfulness, offering kagiri and toast with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Charles Harrow sat beside Sylvia Grey, his expression guarded, while Sylvia herself, pale but composed, sipped her tea with a steadiness that suggested determination rather than calm. Mrs. Clara Dunham, her usual vivacity tempered, confined herself to remarks about the weather, though her eyes darted eagerly between the others. Dr. Ernest Quill, nursing a cup of black coffee, muttered about the folly of midnight alarms. And Mr. Victor Lane, the solicitor, entered late, his brow more furrowed than ever, his hands clasped tightly as if to steady them. Miss Marple, taking her place, noted the teapot's return to its velvet cloth on the sideboard, its silver surface gleaming as if untouched by the previous night's drama. She accepted a cup of tea from the maid, her fingers brushing the saucer as she murmured her thanks, and settled into her chair, her knitting needles soon clicking softly. The conversation was stilted, the memory of Sylvia's scream hanging over the table like a mist. Beatrice, attempting to dispel it, mentioned plans for a walk in the grounds, but her suggestion met with half-hearted murmurs. It was Clara who broke the silence, her voice low but carrying. "I must say, Miss Grey, you gave us quite a fright last night. All that talk of shadowy figures, positively gothic. Though I suppose one can't be too careful with such a valuable piece as that teapot about." Sylvia's cup clinked against its saucer, but her voice was steady. "I saw what I saw, Mrs. Dunham. I'm not given to fancies." Charles's hand tightened on his fork. "Let's leave it, Clara. Sylvia's had enough of this nonsense." Dr. Quill snorted, his white hair catching the light. "Nonsense, it may be, but it stirred up the house. That teapot's more trouble than it's worth. Why not lock it in a safe and be done with it?" Beatrice's smile faltered. "It's a family heirloom, Ernest. One doesn't simply lock away one's history." Miss Marple, her needles pausing, glanced at the teapot. "It is a remarkable piece," she said, her tone mild. "I couldn't help but notice its inscriptions yesterday. Veritas in Umbris, such a curious phrase. It suggests a secret worth guarding, doesn't it?" Victor Lane shifted in his seat, his eyes flicking to the teapot before returning to his plate. Miss Marple noted the movement, her mind cataloguing his unease. The breakfast continued, but the air remained heavy, and when the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts turning to the teapot's hollow base and Victor's quick inspection the night before. She spent the morning in the drawing room, her knitting a pretext for observation. Sylvia and Charles had retreated to the garden, their figures visible through the window, their conversation appearing strained. Beatrice busied herself with household matters, her steps brisk but her face weary. Clara, unable to resist, cornered Dr. Quill by the fireplace, whispering about Sylvia's questionable connections, while Quill's dry laughter suggested he found the gossip amusing but not surprising. It was after luncheon, as Miss Marple sat in the library with a volume of poetry she was not reading, that Victor Lane sought her out. The library was a haven of quiet, its shelves heavy with leather-bound tomes, its air scented with old paper and polish. Victor closed the door behind him, his face grave, and took a seat opposite her, his hands clasped tightly. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice low, "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I felt I must speak to someone discreet. You strike me as a woman of sense, not swayed by the chatter in this house." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression one of gentle interest. "You're very kind, Mr. Lane. I'm always happy to listen. What troubles you?" Victor hesitated, his eyes darting to the door as if fearing interruption. "It's about the Teapot, the Harrow estate. As the family solicitor, I've been tasked with updating Sir Reginald's will, which leaves the bulk of the estate to Charles, provided he marries suitably. It's an old-fashioned clause, but binding. Lady Beatrice has concerns about Miss Grey's suitability." Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze steady. "Concerns. Based on the rumours Mrs. Dunham is so fond of spreading." Victor nodded, his jaw tightening. "Partly. There's talk of a past entanglement in London, an artist, married, who caused a scandal. Beatrice fears it could tarnish the family's name, and the will's terms are strict. But there's more." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've heard rumours about the teapot itself. Some say it conceals a compartment with documents, a codicil. Perhaps that could alter the will's terms. I dismissed it as legend, but after last night," Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her face remained serene. "You think someone was searching for this codicil?" "I don't know," Victor admitted, running a hand through his thinning hair. "But Sylvia's scream, the teapot's position, it's all too convenient. If such a document exists, it could change everything. Charles's inheritance, Sylvia's future, even Beatrice's position." Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "A hidden compartment would explain much," she said. "Have you examined the teapot yourself?" Victor flushed, his hands clenching. "Briefly, last night. The base feels hollow, but I found no mechanism. I didn't want to draw attention. If there's truth to the rumor, I must protect the family's interests." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured, her tone soothing. "You're in a delicate position, Mr. Lane, but secrets have a way of surfacing, don't they? Like truth in shadows." Victor managed a tight smile, rising to leave. "You're very understanding, Miss Marple. I only hope this weekend passes without further disturbances." As the door closed behind him, Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. Victor's confidence was revealing, but his nervousness suggested he knew more than he had shared. A codicil hidden in the teapot could indeed shift the balance of power in the manor, and Sylvia's past, whether true or exaggerated, was a convenient lever to challenge her place. But who stood to gain? Beatrice, protecting the family's honor; Charles, securing his inheritance; or someone else, lurking in the shadows? That evening, Miss Marple joined the guests for dinner, her black lace dress lending her an air of quiet dignity. The teapot, returned to its place on the sideboard, seemed to dominate the room, its presence a silent challenge. Charles and Sylvia sat close, their conversation low, while Beatrice's attempts at levity fell flat. Clara's gossip was restrained, perhaps sensing the mood, but Dr. Quill's barbed remarks about fortune hunters drew a flush to Sylvia's cheeks. After dinner, in the drawing room, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting a steady companion. She overheard Clara pressing Sylvia about her time in London, and Sylvia's sharp retort, "My life is my own, Mrs. Dunham." Charles, intervening, placed a protective hand on Sylvia's shoulder, but his eyes were troubled. Miss Marple's needles paused, her thoughts circling back to Victor's words. The teapot, she decided, was no mere heirloom, it was a catalyst, stirring motives she had yet to fully discern. As the guests retired, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the teapot. Its inscriptions gleamed in the firelight, a riddle waiting to be solved. She sensed the manor's secrets were drawing closer to the surface, and she resolved to watch more closely, knowing the truth was never far from those who sought it. Chapter 5. The Vanishing Clutha. Morning after the midnight disturbance at Tippington Manor. A heavy mist clung to the grounds, shrouding the gardens in a veil of grey and muffling the distant calls of rooks. Miss Jane Marple rising with her customary punctuality, dressed in a soft woolen dress of dove grey, her silver hair neatly pinned, and descended to the breakfast room, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The events of the previous night, Sylvia Grey's scream, the teapot's subtle shift, and Victor Lane's cryptic revelation about a possible codicil had left her mind alert, sifting through the threads of motive and opportunity. The manor, for all its grandeur, felt like a stage where each player concealed their true role. The breakfast room was nearly empty when she arrived, the long table set with pristine linen and silver, but the air heavy with an unspoken tension. Lady Beatrice Harrow, already seated, greeted Miss Marple with a wan smile, her hands fidgeting with a teaspoon. The teapot, that enigmatic heirloom, was conspicuously absent from its usual place on the sideboard. and Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the bare velvet cloth before she took her seat. Charles Harrow entered moments later, his face pale and his manner distracted, followed by Sylvia Grey, whose composure seemed brittle, her green eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. Mrs. Clara Dunham, arriving with a rustle of silk, remarked on the mist with forced cheer, while Dr. Ernest Quill, sipping coffee, muttered about the damp exacerbating his ailments. Victor Lane was absent, a fact Miss Marple filed away for later consideration. "Where is the teapot, Beatrice?" Clara asked, her tone light but her eyes gleaming with curiosity. "I do hope it hasn't been misplaced after last night's excitement." Beatrice's hand trembled, and her tea sloshed slightly. "I'm sure it's being polished," she said, her voice strained. "The servants are very thorough." Miss Marple, buttering a slice of toast, observed the exchange with quiet interest. Beatrice's evasion was telling, and the absence of the teapot, so soon after Sylvia's claim of seeing a figure tampering with it, was no coincidence. She sipped her tea, her needles clicking softly as she began to knit, her presence as unassuming as ever, yet her mind razor-sharp. Breakfast was barely concluded when a commotion erupted. Beatrice, rising to check with the housekeeper, returned. Moments later, her face ashen. "The teapot, it's gone," she announced, her voice breaking. "It's not in the dining room, nor with the servants. It's vanished." The guests froze, their reactions a study in contrasts. Charles's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing to Sylvia, who gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Clara's eyebrows shot up, her expression one of delighted shock, while Dr. Quill snorted, muttering about predictable theatrics. Miss Marple, setting her knitting aside, rose and approached the sideboard, her eyes scanning the velvet cloth. There, caught in the fibers, was a tiny silver fragment, no larger than a breadcrumb, its edge etched with a curve that matched the teapot's intricate engravings. She slipped it into her handkerchief with a deft movement, unnoticed by the others, and turned to Beatrice. "Perhaps we might examine the scene more closely," Miss Marple suggested, her tone gentle but firm. "Theft is a serious matter, and clues are often left behind." Beatrice, clutching her handkerchief, nodded and led the group to the dining room. The room was as they had left it the previous night, the long table cleared, the tapestries undisturbed. The sideboard, however, bore faint scratches on its polished surface, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the marks, her mind picturing the teapot's weight and the haste of its removal. Sylvia, standing close to Charles, whispered, "I told you I saw someone. It wasn't my imagination." Charles's hand rested on her shoulder, but his voice was sharp. "Let's not jump to conclusions, Sylvia. It could be a servant's mistake." Dr. Quill scoffed, adjusting his spectacles. "A servant stealing a family heirloom? Unlikely. Beatrice, your staff is loyal, isn't it? This smells of something more calculated." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, but she straightened, her voice steadying. "My staff has been with us for years. I trust them implicitly, but I'll have Hodges question everyone at once." Miss Marple, her expression serene, knelt to inspect the sideboard, her fingers brushing the scratches. "These marks suggest haste," she said, almost to herself. "Whoever moved the teapot was not careful. And this fragment," she hesitated, choosing not to reveal the silver piece in her handkerchief. "It may have come loose in the process." Clara, hovering nearby, seized on the comment. "A fragment? Oh, this is too thrilling. Do Do you think it's a clue, Miss Marple? Perhaps Sylvia's shadowy figure left it behind. Sylvia flushed, her eyes flashing. I wish you'd stop, Mrs. Dunham. I'm not making this up. Miss Marple smiled gently, diffusing the tension. We're all a little shaken, my dear, but facts will guide us better than speculation. Beatrice, might we speak with the servants who were on duty last night? Beatrice nodded, summoning the housekeeper, Mrs. Ellis, a stout woman with a nonsense air. Mrs. Ellis confirmed that no one had touched the teapot, and the dining room had been locked after the guests retired. The only servant near the room was Elsie, the housemaid, who had been fetching linens from a nearby closet. Miss Marple, with Beatrice's permission, asked to speak with Elsie privately. In the housekeeper's parlour, Elsie, a nervous girl of 19, twisted her apron as she answered Miss Marple's gentle questions. I didn't see nothing, ma'am, I swear, she said, her eyes wide, but I did hear footsteps, late, after Miss Grey's scream. I thought it was just the house settling, but now I ain't so sure. Miss Marple patted her hand. You've done very well to tell me, Elsie. And did you see anyone near the dining room earlier, before the scream? Elsie hesitated, then whispered, Mr. Lane, ma'am. He was in the hall, near the dining room, just before I went to bed. Said he was checking the windows, but they was all locked tight. Miss Marple nodded, her face betraying nothing. Thank you, Elsie. You've been most helpful. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found Victor Lane alone, his face pale as he stared out the window. She approached, her voice soft. Mr. Lane, a word, if I may. The housemaid mentioned seeing you near the dining room last night. You were checking the windows, I believe. Victor started, his hands clenching. Yes, I thought I heard a draft. Old houses, you know. I meant no harm. Of course, Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. But with the teapot missing, every detail matters. You're certain? You saw nothing unusual? Victor's eyes flickered, but he shook his head. Nothing, Miss Marple. I wish I had. Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm as she took a seat. Victor's denial was plausible, but his nervousness suggested more. The silver fragment in her handkerchief, the scratches on the sideboard. Elsie's footsteps, they pointed to a deliberate act, not a servant's error. The teapot's disappearance, she suspected, was tied to the codicil Victor had mentioned, a document that could alter the Harrow inheritance. But who had taken it, and why? As the day progressed, the manor's atmosphere grew heavier. Beatrice, distraught, retreated to her rooms, while Charles and Sylvia kept to the garden, their conversation low and urgent. Clara's gossip took on a feverish edge, hinting that Sylvia herself might have staged the theft to deflect suspicion. Dr. Quill, dismissing the affair as melodrama, nevertheless watched the others with a calculating eye. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, let the pieces fall into place. The teapot, she was certain, had not left the manor. It was hidden, its secret too valuable to risk exposure. By evening, the teapot remained missing, and Beatrice announced that the police would be called if it was not found by morning. Miss Marple, retiring to her room, sat by the window, her knitting untouched. The silver fragment, now tucked in her reticule, was a tangible clue, but the true mystery lay in the motives. It revealed someone in the manor feared the teapot's truth, and she was determined to uncover it before the shadows deepened further. Chapter 6. The garden revelation. The mist that had cloaked Tippington Manor the previous morning had lifted by midday. giving way to a pale sun that bathed the grounds in a soft, hesitant light. Miss Jane Marple, ever attuned to the rhythms of the day, had spent the morning in quiet observation, her knitting needles moving steadily as she sat in the drawing room, her mild blue eyes missing nothing. The disappearance of the silver teapot, with its cryptic inscriptions and rumoured hidden compartment, had cast a pall over the household, and the guests moved with the cautious tread of those aware they were under scrutiny. Lady Beatrice Harrow's threat to summon the police had sharpened the tension, and Miss Marple sensed the manor's secrets were drawing closer to the surface, like bubbles rising in a still pond. After a luncheon marked by strained silences, Miss Marple excused herself for a stroll in the gardens, her shawl draped over her shoulders and her knitting bag in hand. The gardens were a marvel of order, with neatly clipped hedges and rose beds bursting with late blooms, their petals vivid against the green. She wandered past a sundial, its shadow faint in the diffused light, and paused by a stone fountain, its gentle trickle a soothing counterpoint to the manor's disquiet. It was there, seated on a weathered bench, that she found Sylvia Grey, her auburn hair loose and her face streaked with tears. Miss Marple approached with her usual gentleness, her footsteps soft on the gravel path. "My dear Miss Grey," she said, her voice warm, "may I join you? The garden is so peaceful, but I see it hasn't quite lifted your spirits." Sylvia started, wiping her eyes hastily, but she nodded, scooting to one side of the bench. "Please, Miss Marple, I didn't expect anyone to find me here. I just needed to be alone." Miss Marple settled beside her, her knitting bag at her feet, her hands folded in her lap. "Solitude can be a comfort," she said, "but sometimes a kind ear is better. You've had a trying time, haven't you?" Sylvia's lips trembled, and she looked away, her gaze fixed on the fountain's rippling surface. "It's all so overwhelming," she whispered. "The teapot, the whispers, the way everyone looks at me like I'm hiding something. I thought coming here, with Charles, would be a new beginning, but it's as if my past won't let me go." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was sharp, cataloguing Sylvia's words. "The past can be a heavy burden," she said, "especially when others wield it against us. Would it help to share a little? I'm an old woman, my dear, and I've heard many stories. Yours won't shock me." Sylvia hesitated, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. Then, as if a dam had broken, the words poured out. "There was a man in London," she said, her voice low. "An artist, older, married. I was young, foolish, and I thought he loved me. He promised to leave his wife, but he never did. When I realized the truth, I ended it, but the scandal followed me. People like Mrs. Dunham, they twist it, make it sound sordid. I told Charles everything before we were engaged, and he said it didn't matter, but now I think he's doubting me, and someone's using it to ruin me." Miss Marple listened without interruption, her expression one of quiet sympathy. Sylvia's confession was heartfelt, and though the details matched Clara Dunham's gossip, the girl's sincerity suggested the affair was more a mistake than a crime. "You've been honest with Charles," Miss Marple said, patting Sylvia's hand. "That's what matters. But you believe someone is spreading these stories deliberately?" Sylvia nodded, her eyes fierce. "Yes, I don't know who or why, but it's not just idle talk. It's as if they want to drive a wedge between me and Charles, or between Charles and the estate." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she drew her knitting from the bag, the familiar motion grounding her thoughts. Sylvia's words pointed to a calculated effort, and the teapot's disappearance, with its rumoured codicil, suggested a motive tied to the Harrow inheritance, but whose hand was at work? Dr. Quill, with his barbed remarks, Clara, thriving on scandal, or Victor Lane, whose solicitor's duties gave him access to family secrets? Before she could probe further, the crunch of gravel announced Charles Harrow's approach. He paused at the sight of Miss Marple, his face darkening, but he softened as he saw Sylvia's tear-streaked cheeks. "Sylvia, are you all right?" he asked, his voice tight. "Miss Marple, I hope you're not distressing her." "Not at all, Mr. Harrow," Miss Marple replied, her tone serene. "We were just chatting about the garden's charms. Miss Grey was kind enough to keep an old woman company." Sylvia managed a weak smile. "It's true, Charles. Miss Marple been very kind." Charles hesitated, then sat beside Sylvia, taking her hand. "I'm sorry if I've been distant," he said, his voice low. "This business with the Teapot, it's got everyone on edge. But I trust you, Sylvia. You know that, don't you?" Sylvia's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, squeezing his hand. Miss Marple, rising to give them privacy, murmured her excuses and wandered back toward the manor, her mind busy. Charles's reassurance was genuine, but his tension suggested doubts lingered, perhaps fueled by the same whispers Sylvia feared. The Teapot, she suspected, held the key to those doubts and to the truth someone wished to suppress. Inside, Miss Marple found Beatrice in the drawing room, arranging flowers with a distracted air. The Teapot's absence was palpable, the sideboard bare save for a vase of roses. Beatrice looked up, her face weary. "Jane, you've been in the garden. I hope it's brought you some peace. This house feels so heavy today." "It's a trying time," Miss Marple agreed, settling into a chair. "The Teapot's loss weighs on us all. Have you had any word from the servants?" Beatrice shook her head, her fingers faltering on a stem. "Nothing. Hodges questioned everyone, but no one saw a thing. I can't believe it's gone. Reginald loved that teapot, said it was the family's heart." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the sideboard, recalling the scratches and the silver fragment in her reticule. "It's a curious piece," she said. "Mr. Lane mentioned a possible compartment. Do you think there's truth to that?" Beatrice's hands stilled, and she met Miss Marple's gaze, her expression guarded. "I don't know, Jane. Reginald used to tease about secrets, but he never showed me anything. If there's a compartment, it's as much a mystery to me as to anyone." Miss Marple nodded, her smile benign, but her thoughts were far from idle. Beatrice's uncertainty seemed genuine, but her nervousness suggested she feared what the teapot might reveal. As she resumed her knitting, Miss Marple overheard voices from the study across the hall. Dr. Quill and Beatrice, their tones low but urgent. Slipping closer to the door, her movements silent, she caught fragments of their conversation. "Must speak to Charles," Quill was saying, his voice sharp. "Sylvia's unsuitable, Beatrice. You know it. The estate can't afford another scandal." Beatrice's reply was faint, trembling. "I want Charles to be happy, earnest, but the will, if Sylvia's past comes out." Miss Marple retreated, her heart quickening. Quill's insistence and Beatrice's hesitation pointed to the same. Fear Sylvia had voiced a campaign to discredit her, tied to the estate's future. The teapot, with its rumoured codicil, could hold proof of that future, and its disappearance was no accident. As evening approached, Miss Marple resolved to watch more closely. The garden revelation had shown her Sylvia's heart, but the manor's shadows held darker truths, and the teapot, wherever it was hidden, was the key to unlocking them. Chapter 7. The Hidden Compartment. The night following Sylvia Grey's garden confession wrapped Tippington Manor in a stillness that felt more like anticipation than peace. Miss Jane Marple, lying awake in her four-poster bed, her shawl draped over her shoulders, could not shake the restless energy that had settled over her. The teapot's disappearance, Sylvia's tearful revelation, and the overheard conversation between Lady Beatrice Harrow and Dr. Ernest Quill had woven a web of suspicion in her mind. The silver fragment in her reticule, the scratches on the sideboard, and Victor Lane's nervous admission about a possible codicil pointed to a truth concealed within the manor's walls. Sleep eluded her, and as the clock struck 1, she resolved to act, slipping on her dressing gown and soft slippers. Miss Marple took a small flashlight from her suitcase, a practical item she always carried for such occasions. The manor was silent, save for the occasional creak of ancient timbers, and the moonlight filtering through the corridor windows cast long shadows across the polished floors. She moved with the quiet grace of one accustomed to going unnoticed, her destination the dining room where the teapot had last been seen. Her instincts told her that the heirloom, though declared missing, had not left the manor. Its value was too great, its secret too dangerous. The dining room was dark, the heavy drapes drawn, and the air carried the faint scent of beeswax and old wood. Miss Marple's flashlight beam danced across the tapestries and the long mahogany table, settling on the sideboard where the teapot had stood. The velvet cloth lay bare, but the scratches she had noted earlier were still visible, etched into the polished surface like a silent accusation. Kneeling with surprising ease for her years, she examined the sideboard more closely, her fingers tracing the marks. They were uneven, suggesting haste, and a faint smudge of dust near the edge caught her ajar clue that the sideboard itself might hold more than it seemed. Her hands, steady despite the chill of the room, explored the lower panel of the sideboard, pressing gently along its seams. A soft click rewarded her patience, and the panel sprang open, revealing a shallow compartment. There, nestled in the shadows, was the silver teapot, its engravings gleaming faintly in the flashlight's beam. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she remained calm, her mind sharp as she lifted the teapot with care. It was heavier than expected, its base solid yet hollow, as Victor Lane had suggested. Turning it over, she found a faint seam, barely visible, circling the base. With delicate pressure, she twisted, and a small section clicked open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a folded parchment, yellowed with age, its edges frayed but intact. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the cramped, formal script. It was a codicil to Sir Reginald Harrow's will, dated years before his death, and its contents were startling. The document stipulated that, should Charles Harrow fail to marry a suitable spouse, as deemed by the family's solicitor, the estate would pass to a distant Kazuna, named Miss Marple did not immediately recognize, but committed to memory. The codicil's implications were clear. Sylvia Grey's rumored past could be used to challenge her suitability, redirecting the inheritance. Before she could read further, a faint creak from the corridor froze her. Footsteps, deliberate but soft, approached the dining room. Miss Marple swiftly replaced the parchment, closed the compartment, and set the teapot back in its hiding place, easing the sideboard panel shut. She retreated to the shadows behind a tapestry, her flashlight extinguished, her breathing steady despite the racing of her heart. The door opened, and a figure entered, their silhouette tall and angular in the moonlight. It was Victor Lane, his face pale, his hands clutching a small tooler screwdriver, perhaps for prying open secrets. Victor moved to the sideboard, his movements furtive, and knelt where Miss Marple had been moments before. He pressed the panel, and it sprang open, revealing the teapot. He lifted it, his fingers searching the base. But before he could open the compartment, another sound, a distant cough, made him pause. With a muttered curse, he replaced the teapot, closed the panel, and slipped from the room, his footsteps fading into the night. Miss Marple emerged, her mind racing. Victor's presence confirmed her suspicions. He knew of the teapot's hiding place and its secret. But was he protecting the codicil or seeking to destroy it? And why had he hidden the teapot in the first place? She considered retrieving the parchment, but decided against it. The risk of discovery was too great, and the document was safer where it was for now. Returning to her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting untouched, her thoughts weaving a pattern from the night's discoveries. The codicil explained the tension surrounding Sylvia's engagement, but it raised new questions. Who was the distant cousin named in the document? Was it Dr. Quill, whose sharp tongue masked a deeper interest in the estate? Or another, yet unseen, player in the manor's drama? At breakfast, the teapot's absence was not mentioned, as if Beatrice had silently agreed to delay the police. The guests were subdued, their eyes avoiding the bare sideboard. Sylvia, pale but resolute, sat close to Charles, who seemed more protective than the previous day. Clara Dunham's chatter was muted, her gossip replaced by complaints about the damp, while Dr. Quill's sardonic remarks targeted the manor's upkeep rather than Sylvia. Victor Lane, entering late, avoided Miss Marple's gaze, his hands unsteady as he poured his tea. Miss Marple, sipping her own tea, observed the group with quiet intensity. The teapot, she knew, was back in its hiding place, its secret intact for now, but Victor's midnight visit suggested time was short. The codicil, with its power to reshape the Harrow legacy, was a prize worth stealing, and she suspected the next move would come soon. As the morning unfolded, Miss Marple resolved to keep the teapot's location to herself, letting the thief believe their secret safe. The hidden compartment had revealed one truth, but others lurked in the manor's shadows, and she was determined to uncover them before the teapot's secret could be silenced forever. Chapter 8. The Truth in Shadows. The final morning at Tippington Manor broke with a fragile calm, the sun casting long rays through the mist that still lingered over the gardens. Miss Jane Marple, having slept little after her midnight discovery of the teapot's hidden compartment, dressed with care in her best black lace frock, her silver hair pinned neatly beneath a modest hat. The weight of the silver fragment in her reticule and the memory of the codicil's contensor document, naming a distant cousin as heir should Charles Harrow's marriage prove unsuitable, pressed upon her mind. The manor's secrets, stirred by the teapot's disappearance and reappearance, were poised to unravel, and Miss Marple sensed the moment for truth had come. The breakfast room was hushed. The guests gathered with the air of those awaiting a verdict. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her face pale but composed, presided over the table, the empty sideboard a silent reminder of the teapot's absence. Charles Harrow sat beside Sylvia Grey, his hand resting protectively on hers, while Sylvia's green eyes, though weary, held a quiet resolve. Mrs. Clara Dunham, subdued for once, toyed with her toast, her usual gossip replaced by nervous glances. Dr. Ernest Quill, sipping coffee, maintained his cynical air, but his sharp gaze betrayed an alertness. Victor Lane, entering last, looked haggard, his hands unsteady as he took his seat. Avoiding Miss Marple's serene gaze, the teapots returned to the sideboard. Unnoticed by the others was Miss Marple's doing. After Victor's midnight retreat, she had retrieved it from the sideboard's hidden compartment, placing it back on its velvet cloth before dawn. The codicil, however, remained in her reticule, a secret she guarded until the moment was right. She sipped her tea, her knitting needles idle, her mind weaving the final threads of the mystery. After breakfast, as the guests lingered in the drawing room, Miss Marple requested a private word with Beatrice. In the library, surrounded by leather-bound tomes and the faint scent of old paper, she spoke softly, her tone disarming. "Beatrice, my dear, I believe the teapot's mystery is solved. Might we gather everyone? There's something they should hear." Beatrice, her eyes wide with apprehension, agreed, and soon the guests assembled in the drawing room, the teapot gleaming on its table like a silent witness. Miss Marple stood by the hearth, her small figure commanding attention despite her unassuming air. "You've all been troubled by the teapot's disappearance," she began, her voice clear, "and by the tensions it has stirred. But its secret is no longer hidden." She produced the silver fragment from her reticule, holding it up to the light. This came from the teapot's engravings, caught in the sideboard's cloth when it was moved. It led me to the teapot itself, hidden in a compartment beneath the sideboard, where I found a codicil to Sir Reginald's will. A gasp rippled through the room. Charles's hand tightened on Sylvia's, and Beatrice's face drained of colour. Victor Lane shifted, his eyes darting to the door, while Clara's mouth fell open. Dr. Quill's eyebrows rose, but he said nothing, his gaze fixed on Miss Marple. "The codicil," she continued, "states that if Charles marries an unsuitable spouse, the estate passes to a distant cousin, Dr. Ernest Quill." She turned to Quill, whose face betrayed a flicker of surprise, quickly masked. "You knew of this, didn't you, Dr. Quill? And you used Sylvia's past to cast doubt on her, hoping to secure the inheritance." Quill blustered, rising from his chair. "Preposterous. I knew nothing of any codicil. This is slander." Miss Marple's smile was gentle but unyielding. "I overheard you urging Beatrice to confront Charles about Sylvia's unsuitability, and your remarks about fortune hunters were hardly subtle. You spread rumours, knowing they'd reach Beatrice, who feared for the estate's future." Beatrice's voice trembled. "Is this true, Ernest?" Before Quill could reply, Miss Marple turned to Victor Lane. "And you, Mr. Lane, hid the teapot to protect the codicil, didn't you? As solicitor, you knew its contents and feared exposure would disrupt the family. I saw you in the dining room last night, searching for it." Victor's shoulders slumped, his face ashen. "I meant no harm," he admitted. "I thought hiding it would buy time to settle things quietly. I didn't want the family torn apart." Sylvia's eyes filled with tears, but she spoke firmly. "My past is no secret to Charles. I loved someone once, but it's over. I've done nothing to shame this family." Charles stood, his arm around her. "Sylvia's right. I love her, codicil or no. The estate means nothing without her." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes softening. "The teapot's truth is simple. Fear and greed twisted honest hearts. Sylvia's past is irrelevant. Her love for Charles is true. The codicil, though legal, need not divide you. Truth, as its inscriptions say, lies in shadows, but it shines when faced." Beatrice, tears streaming, embraced Sylvia. "Forgive me, my dear. I let fear blind me." Quill, cornered, muttered an apology, his bravado gone. Clara, for once speechless, fanned herself, while Victor offered to destroy the codicil, his voice heavy with regret. Miss Marple handed it to Beatrice, her work done. As the guests dispersed, the teapot gleamed silently, its secret no longer a burden. Miss Marple, gathering her knitting, felt the manor's shadows lift, the truth revealed as gently as sunlight breaking through mist. The end.